Thank you and good morning. Thank you, musicians. Thank you, Keith, for leading us. If you have your Bibles, please turn to Hebrews chapter 2. May I ask you a question? How's your week been? Has it been up to expectations? Has it been good? Disappointments? Discouragements? Surprises? I wonder how the Lord's going to speak to you through his word this morning from these particular verses. But let me say this, whatever your week has been like, however good, bad, up, down, whatever your feelings, here's the message that the writer has for them, and I think God has for us this morning. The writer wants to drive home one thing: we see Jesus. Have you seen him this morning? Do you see him? Does he fill your eyes? And the reason that the writer is doing this in what later in the book he calls a little exhortation, which is what these chapters are about. He's writing to those who are obviously struggling with their Christian life. And the glorious picture that he's painted of Jesus in chapter 1, supreme over all, superior to all, the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, that glorious picture seems a long way from their Christian experience. In fact, they're in danger, as we'll read later on. They're in danger of giving up. The struggle is getting too great. They are in danger of giving up their faith or going back to their old ways. Now, Keith very helpfully drew our attention last week to how that process was beginning for them. And we have to ask ourselves, what is it that this chapter is addressing? What's the problem that these verses are speaking to? And the problem is this, that the readers are in danger certainly of struggling, giving up their walk with Jesus, giving up their faith, and they're going back to something more tangible, visible, something they know, they're more comfortable with. And there are, I think, 2-3 reasons that is pushing them into this position, reasons that actually very common to us as well. Keith mentioned drift last week, moving imperceptibly away from the Lord. They're not paying attention. If you walk along the beach in California, there are notices that say this: never turn your back on the ocean. Why? Because a rogue wave may come and sweep you away. They've lost their focus. They've lost sight of their so great salvation. They're drifting. Like a boat where the power has lost, the engine has gone, the boat has lost its power. First time and the only time I ever went sailing was with a friend in Poole Harbour. Never been to Poole Harbour before. He'd got a boat. He said, come, let's go sailing. We went out, and do you know what? We were drifting. So much so that when the tide went out, we were stuck on the mud. And we were there until the tide came back in again. Drift. You know, it's sad, isn't it? They started so well with spiritual vitality, miracles, gifts of the Holy Spirit, God, signs, wonders. God was at work, and now something has cooled them down. The attraction of angels, supernatural experiences, the old ways, things that they can see and touch. Well, that's one thing that's happening. But I think if you read the book, we need to understand he's addressing other problems too. The problem of discouragement. If you go later into the book, you'll find that there are hardships, the spoiling of their goods. People they've been robbed. We were robbed 3 times in Bangkok. We had just arrived back from home assignment. We'd actually managed to bring a couple of bicycles for our children. We'd hardly unpacked them, hardly got them into our place in Bangkok, and we were burgled, and those lovely things had disappeared. And 3 times we were burgled. Not uncommon. But they were having their goods spoiled. They were facing ridicule and mockery. Sometimes it says in chapter 10, you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. And you stood side by side, but you're in trouble. Physical danger. You haven't resisted. You haven't had to stand your ground as a Christian to the point where it risked your life. You haven't yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. Some of you are in prison. It's a pretty discouraging circumstance in which they find themselves. Ridicule, vulnerability, sustained suspicion. You know, it's very hard to live and work when you're under suspicion all the time. And there are many in today's world who are living and working among people where they are under suspicion because they are Christians. It's hard to stand up to that day after day. Discouragement can drive you away from Christ. And yet, what the writer wants to say is, look, commitment to Jesus is a high-risk commitment. You're in for the high risk that's involved. And I have to say that many around our world are facing a high-risk commitment to stand for Jesus Christ. And it grinds you down, doesn't it? Day after day, as a minority people in a pluralistic, hostile society, you feel vulnerable and exposed to public ridicule. And that's part of their problem. But it's not the only problem. That's why the writer says in verse 5, he talks about the age to come. And in chapter 1, he'd spoken about the last days and the world to come and the glowing terms of victory and triumph. Well, this wasn't happening. And it's disappointing when your hopes of victory and your hopes of triumph and your hopes of living above circumstances are not being realized. The vibrancy of those early days seems to have passed, and they're disappointed indeed. Jesus does not seem to be a world beater. That's the present reality. The humiliation of Christ as a leader sits uncomfortably in their culture, a culture where death by crucifixion is so repulsive. It's never mentioned in polite society, where Christians follow a leader who died in disgrace and humiliation. And you can see the pull, can't you? The pull to give up. I had an email from Ajith Fernando, one of the godliest men I know, who's headed up the work of Youth for Christ in Sri Lanka. International speaker, has written many books, and he just wrote, and he said this: it's so hard to teach about honesty and integrity and holiness in our Sri Lankan society when it doesn't pay and it grinds you down. You can see why they're being pushed to go back to something less demanding, less costly, less disturbing, something that is more visual and tangible, something less embarrassing. And I think that's why the writer says here, because I think they were embarrassed. They found it awkward to confess Jesus. I think that's why in these verses we've just read, the writer says, well, look, you may be embarrassed, but Jesus is not ashamed to call you his brothers. He's not ashamed. Are you? Are you ashamed of Jesus? Do you wriggle with embarrassment at all? So the writer is pleading with them. That's what he's saying. And that's what these verses are all about. He's pleading with them. Don't go back. Don't lose your confidence. And in what to me in chapter 12, verse 12, is a very personal word. He says, strengthen your drooping hands and your weak knees. You see, the Lord has a word for us all, doesn't he? So those are the things that are pulling back. And what do they need? Because they are in serious trouble. What do they need? What the writer says is you need to get hold of this so great salvation. You need to see what you're in danger of sliding away from, drifting away from. What's grinding you down? Let me ask you a question. How are you doing in the glory of the grind of every day? How are you doing when it grinds you down? Are you standing firm? And this message is not for those just struggling, by the way. It's for all of us who want to know Jesus, who want to go deeper with him, who want to love him more, who want to be able to say, I long to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering. So the need is this. He's got to do two things that will help them. And the first is this. You need to know that the future is secure, that living for God and Jesus now is wonderful, and it is worth living for, and if necessary, Jesus is worth dying for. You've got to know that the future is secure. And it's worth the struggles now for what lies ahead. Think of a Chinese lady who was taken in an accusation session during the Cultural Revolution. And she's encircled by those who were accusing her. That's what they were called, accusation sessions. And they were asking her very, very difficult questions. Who is Jesus? Who is this Jesus? You say he's God, but he's a man. And challenging, and she wasn't particularly strong in her grasp. But she said these words, Sirs, I can't answer your difficult questions, but this I know, I would gladly die for Jesus. We need to know that the future is secure, and we need to know that we have a strong and sympathetic leader who is with us. We are not alone. And so the whole of this passage brings focus to us to see Jesus, the one who is the answer, who can stand with us. And the writer says very clearly, the future is secure. It's true, Jesus is supreme. He is superior to everything else, verses 7 and 8. He was made a little lower than the angels, crowned with glory and honor, has put everything under his feet. But that hasn't happened yet. That hasn't happened yet, but it's coming. It's true, but at the present time, we do not see everything subject to Jesus. But it is, and it will be. We're in the last days. The world to come has begun. God's kingdom has come. It was announced by Jesus. But hold on, the future is secure. He is now crowned with honor and glory, and he is bringing many sons to glory. And the future is secure. Back in October, I tuned into the radio 5 Live. It was a League Cup match. Those of you who know me know that I'm a great Arsenal supporter. And I tuned into the radio, and the scoreline read, Reading 4, Arsenal 0. So I turned off. I couldn't bear the pain. I couldn't bear the pain. 4-0, and it's not even half time. However, 20 minutes, 30 minutes later, I thought, well, I'll just have a little listen. And suddenly, Arsenal are now winning 5-4, and they go and win 7-5. Now, if I had just turned off and had lost the results, wouldn't that be foolish? We see Jesus crowned with glory and honor. We see Jesus, the pioneer and finisher of our faith. Not only is the future secure, but the present is changed absolutely. He's shared our experiences. He's bringing us to glory, and the pathway to glory, the pathway that he's taking us on, is the pathway that he trod through suffering. And you should understand, says the writer, that yes, you're having a hard time. Yes, there are struggles. Yes, you've been rebuffed. Yes, there's public ridicule. But that's the pathway that Jesus took, and that's the pathway he's taking you on in leading you to glory. Somebody wrote these words, no believer can cope adequately with adversity, struggles, difficulties, problems, unless Jesus fills the horizons of their minds, sharpens their priorities, and controls their experience. That's why the writer says we see Jesus. Do you this morning? Does he fill the horizons of your heart and mind? We see Jesus, the pioneer, author, perfecter of our faith, of our so great salvation. And it is great because look how much it cost, and look how much it took to accomplish. So he points them to Jesus. Jesus, the man. So when he says, we see Jesus, he's using the human name. He's saying, this is Jesus, the man. The one who has entered our world, who's shared our experiences, who understands exactly who we are, where we are, and what it is like. Way back when I was in human resource management in the British motor industry, working in a company that had 3,000 employees, and of most of whom were in a closed shop union membership. I was once having to discipline a trade union official in my office. And he came into my office, we were dealing with the issue, and he turned to me and he said, it's not fair. In those days we called each other Mr., by the way, not Bill and Jack. It's not fair, Mr. Bill, you have no idea what it's like in my section, among the machine shop, the noise, the dirt, the oil, the incessant, repetitive, boring nature of the job. And I said to him, oh, yes, I do. Because part of my training took me onto your section. And I spent I didn't say mindless weeks, but I said I had 2 weeks standing where you stand, doing those boring jobs day in and day out. Oh, yes, I do. And that's what the writer's saying. Look, you're having a hard time. Jesus has come into your experience. And here's the reference to his incarnation. He was made a little lower than the angels. This is a real man, a real birth. And he expounds that. Look, verse 14. Children have flesh and blood. He shared in their humanity. He had real feelings, real experiences. He was tired. He was hungry. He was disappointed. He found people rejected him. He found people, having followed him, turned away and said, we're not going to follow you anymore. He had people come up to him asking for help. He would talk to them, rich young ruler. And Jesus said, well, great, you've done a great deal. Now go and sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and follow me. And you watch that man walk away disappointed. And so although Jesus has been spoken of in chapter 1 clearly as God, the ministry of Jesus is a major theme. The man Jesus goes right through this book. He's shared the same conditions, the same limitations, the same struggles as we do. He knew rejection, he knew joy. He knew the experiences that we go to as well. Why? Because you can't help people by remote control. You can't help people at a distance. If you're going to help people, you need to engage with them at their level. So not only is the incarnation the proof that God has come into our world to rescue us, but he takes it a step further. Jesus identified with us, and that's a deeper step. There's identification here. We do not have a high priest in verse 18 who is unable to sympathize with us, but one who has been tempted in every way. He knows the full force of the struggles, temptations that are common to you and to me, and yet without sin. This is the one who's described in the Gospels. A bruised reed he doesn't break. He doesn't deal with rejects. A smoking wick, a little smoking oil lamp, spluttering, hardly a flame, smoke that gets in your eyes, an irritant. And he says, no, he doesn't snuff it out. He deals with it to bring it back to a burning light. This is the Jesus who can sympathize and act. Do you know him that way? Do you feel rubbish? Do you feel rejected? Do you feel on the edge? Do you feel like a broken reed? Well, he doesn't snap the reed and chuck it away, nor does he snuff out the wick. He can really sympathize. You know, it's common, isn't it, in talking to people to say, yeah, I feel your pain. Are you ever persuaded by that statement? When somebody says to you, I feel your pain, I know just exactly what you're going through. Of course they don't, but he does. And that's the difference. Sympathy, identity. He looked out for people in need, and he could engage with people at every level. He could engage with the poor. He could engage with the needy. He could engage with the theologians. He could engage at every level. That's what it means to enter our world. That's what we must do too. Perhaps the biggest example and the clearest example of this is right at the beginning of his ministry. Jesus goes to the Jordan River, where John is baptizing people who know that they are sinners. They know that they've failed God. They know that their lives are messed up and broken. And John is baptizing them for repentance. And there's a line of them. And Jesus comes and he stands in line with the sinners. And John says, I can't baptize you. You've no sin. And Jesus says, yes, I'm identifying with the people I've come to rescue. And he lines up with the sinners. That's identification. And I remember very, very, very powerfully, in a very poor analogy, lining up in the Singapore Office of Contagious Diseases for a whole year, the only foreigner with a line of others who were there to be examined with contagious diseases. I know what it feels like. And Jesus lined up and stood with sinners. He's not repelled by sinners. He's not standing in judgment and critiquing and poking fun and pointing out difficulties. He lines up to identify in order that he might rescue sinners. So the humanity of Jesus, his incarnation and his identification, that's what the writer's saying. Look, he's been there and he's able to help you. He is not beyond helping you when you are tempted. By the way, the good news is that clock has died. So unless I look at my watch, we could be sailing here forever, so I better be careful. But let me point you to something further, the humility of Jesus. The writer says this in verse 10, in bringing many sons to glory, it was fitting that God, the author of our salvation, the one in whom salvation flows, who takes the initiative, who rescues us in our plight, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation, our salvation, perfect through suffering. Are you suffering? Says the writer. Well, it was fitting that Jesus, in his pathway to glory, should take the pathway of suffering. I found myself my mind boggling. It was fitting. I can't think of anything less fitting that Jesus, the Creator, the sinless Son of God, should enter our world and to take a pathway of pain and suffering for us. And it says here, he tasted death. Wasn't a sham, it was a real death with the bitterest of taste to it. He tasted death for us. And it was fitting. This was God's plan. This is God's purpose. Salvation flows out of the heart and purposes of God. Not our endeavors, not our ideas, not our efforts, but what God has done in sending the Father, sending the Son. And we see Jesus surrendering and submitting to the will and purposes of his Father. Jesus, our pioneer, who makes the way to glory for us, not a glide path downwards, but an upward destination, submits to the will of God and through the pathway of suffering. Look how humble the Son of God, the Creator, the King of Kings really is as he submits to God's will. If you underline the word made, you see how Jesus submits and lets God make him to be what he was not in glory. He was made a little lower than the angels. He, says Paul in the Philippians, he made himself of no reputation. He was made perfect in suffering. Not that he was imperfect morally, but his vocation was completed in that pathway of suffering as he submitted to his Father. He was made like his brothers in every way, no exceptions. He was made like his brothers, and he made atonement for the sins of the people. This is Jesus. Do you see Jesus? Do you see the humble servant king this morning? Do you see him marking out the pathway, the pioneer, the author, the trailblazer, the one who is taking the pathway that takes him through suffering, takes him to the cross? That's his destination again and again in his ministry on earth. And by the way, there is more about Jesus' ministry on earth in this book of Hebrews than any other book in the New Testament apart from the Gospels. And as he takes this path, he humbly, our servant king, has in mind his destination, Jerusalem and the cross. And he's saying, will you follow me? And the writer is saying, do you see Jesus that way? Do you see him in bringing you to glory, taking that path? Are you willing to follow him? Made a little lower than the angels, tasting death, coming that he might free us from the power of Satan and the fear of death, that last unknown frontier, which dogs and drags us down. So the Son, the heavenly, humble Jesus, the servant king. Do you see him this morning? One last thing as we look at Jesus, his heavenly achievements. He came, not only to share our humanity, great though that is, but he came to transform it. That's the purpose. He lived among us in order to rescue and save us and to bring us to glory, to save us from where we were. I like to, when I'm doing evangelism with Thai people, I like to use a picture, because the Thai people are constantly saying, oh, Jesus and Buddha, they're the same. They both teach us to do good, teach us to live well. They teach us to aspire to good things. Well, I said, here's a picture. You're in a boat on the Jalprayar River, and many Thai go on the rivers, they go fishing, they have their boats, but they can't swim, which is very strange. And he's on the boat, and you're on the boat, and the boat flips, and suddenly you're in the river, and you can't swim. And there are two men standing on the bank, and one says to you, swim, save yourself, swim. Well, that's good advice, but you can't swim. The other doesn't say too much, but dives in, swims to you, takes you in his arms, brings you back to the shore of the river, to the bank. Which of those two do you think you would choose? The one who dived in. And I say, yeah, exactly. That's Jesus, who has dived into our world and has come to rescue us, because sin has damaged and degraded us. We are a frustrated people. Even our best aspirations cannot take us. In fact, the writer says, enslaved, held in a grip, a lifelong vice-like grip of the fear of death. And if you want to know more about that, Brian's going to develop that in the enriched stream. Enslaved, but now we see Jesus. And we see what Jesus has done. And because time is running out, we shall look at some of this next week. But here's what he has done. He has freed us from our sins, forgiveness. He has dealt with sin. He's made atonement for our sin. And he is sanctifying us. It says this, both the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy. That's us. And by the way, if you're having a hard time in your Christian life, it may just be that God is answering your prayer to be holy like Jesus, because the pathway there is through suffering. Forgiveness, freedom. He sets us free. He destroys the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and frees those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. He sets you free. And Jesus said, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Are you free this morning? Oh, you're a free person? Or is there a habit? Is there an issue in your life that you cannot break? Is there something that keeps dragging you back? He sets us free and he makes us family. He makes us family. Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers. He makes us family. I'll declare your name to my brothers in the presence of the congregation. Here I am, the children God has given me. We're family. That's one of the fruits of Jesus' life amongst us. That you are God's gift to me, and I'm God's gift to you. And we are God's gift to each other. The achievements of Jesus, we'll look at those a bit in more detail next week. But that's what he came to do. I don't know about you. We see Jesus. Do you? How do you see him? We know that greatness and glory in the kingdom come through suffering and service. So let's fix our eyes on Jesus as he's working to bring us to glory. Speaking for myself, I can only face God and I can only face tomorrow because of Jesus, who has reconciled me to God and who lives with me day by day in the ups and downs and the glory of the grind of each day. And it is from Christ, and only Jesus Christ alone, that I hear those life-giving words, if the Son shall make you free, you will indeed be free. A life-transforming relationship with Jesus that matters more than anything else. A relationship that lasts not only now, in the present, but takes us on into the future and into eternity as he brings many sons to glory. Is Jesus sufficient for you? Is he all that you need, really? Or is he a fallback position? I think the invitation from him, from the writer this morning, we see Jesus not at a distance, but in order to welcome and receive him into our lives. We're going to